as I get into this discussion here, or these thoughts, I'm going to keep as a background Schrödinger's equation of matter as a wave, which he represented by this equation, where the wave function psi is a function of the incremental change in time. So let's keep this in mind. And the way that I'm modeling matter is through the unified field equation that I derived some months ago. And as a recollection, the essential part is there are three matrices, if you will, and the first matrix is a light matrix, and I believe light is central to this whole modeling because in light there's a codification, and this codification expresses itself in subsequent layers of matter as the complexity in matter increases, so from quantum particles subsequently to atoms, subsequently to cells, and so on. But if we think about this light, what I have depicted in this unified equation is four layers, which I have chosen as the layer, untransformed layer. So this is a layer that we're aware of, where light travels at a finite speed, and because of that finiteness, there's a certain nature of reality that's set up, and this nature has to do with creating a past, present, future, and sense of separation, which can all be derived from this finiteness of light. But there's a deeper essence behind these, and that deeper essence I had depicted as existing as a layer where light travels at an infinite speed, and we can think of that as presence, power, knowledge, and harmony being the deep codification that exists in light. And subsequently there was a layer K and a layer N, but the reality at this layer K is a function of the reality that exists at this layer. The reality of the layer N is a function of the reality that exists at CK. The reality at CU is a function of the reality that exists here at N. And what we had derived earlier was that these essences break up into a number of sets that create all the creative possibility that then precipitates into this untransformed layer that subsequently, through the continued action of emergence, becomes more and more transformed. So I had represented this layer here as sets of presence, set of power, set of knowledge, set of harmony, and this layer here, which represents the uniqueness of every single construct, no matter how small or how large, at the untransformed layer, through a combination of the different elements in these sets. So we can simply represent that as being a function of the set of presence multiplied by the set of power, multiplied by the set of knowledge, multiplied by the set of harmony, which should give us an infinite number of elements that become seeds through which the whole emergence in space and time occur. So therefore the second matrix here was looking at the emergence in space and simply saying we have this untransformed layer which basically has four sets. We can think of these sets as the physical, vital, mental, and integral, which are in their essence reflections of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So you have these four untransformed sets, and to the degree that we are able to overcome the patterns so that exist in each of these sets, we allow this layer of the signatures to become active. And to the degree then that these signatures become independent forces, we allow this layer here to become more active. And the reality here is a reflection of these sets, basically of very innovative qualities. So these sets, and to the degree that the forces become completely impersonal, we allow the master essences represented by system, these deep system essences, to become active. So there's this emergence in space, and if we think of how this might play out in time, then we have this layer M3, or this deep intelligence, love, power, harmony that's present in every single space-time instant of our system, is active through all time. There's a precipitation at M2, so that M2 is active at some time, perhaps greater than or equal to 0 all the way to infinity. M1 is active for time greater than 0 to infinity. And U, where we begin to have more complexity at the cellular level, and then greater collectivities, human collectivities and other collectivities, we depict this as two lines. So we have some kind of arbitrary point, 13.8, 10 to the 9 years, which supposedly where cellular life emerges, where we have what we call the transformation circle acting basically from M3 to U, meaning that there's an automaticity in the intelligence that we see at cellular life. But then at a time, so this is a time greater than or equal to 13.8, so at a time greater than 13.8 into 10 to the 9 years, where we have the basis of collectivities based on these cells, we see the reversal where will becomes more active. And so the transformation essentially from these untransformed sets to a transformed set occurs through more and more through the action of will, integration, love, and so on. But we also had represented that this entire equation is iterative. It has an iterative quality to it, so that in the next iteration, this untransformed set is the previous transformed set, which we depict in this manner. And this whole thing we had represented as the equation of this unified field in which everything emerges. But if we break this up a little further so that we can then link to Schrodinger's equation here, then essentially what we are looking at is 4 parts, because we have these 4 essential essences or sets, which at this end we may call them physical, vital, mental, integral, and at this end presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So let's depict this whole possibility in this manner here. So we have this kind of block, and this block itself we can think of as having 4 partitions, so that when we're talking about this matter expressed as a wave, as Schrödinger had envisioned it, then basically this delta psi is actually a more complex breakup of the delta in at least 16 different compartments, if you will. So we can think of this one here to just to give an idea of being the delta of P over T at the untransformed layer U. So let's express that this way. So we have that this delta psi over T is can be expressed as delta physical. So what's the change that's happening at U? Similarly, what's the change in this component that's happening at U? And we also have, so for example, if we go up here, looking at this signature M, then what's the change that's happening in this component here, which is happening at M1 and so on. So there's 16 kind of breakups. So when we think about Schrödinger's equation and his modeling of matter as a wave, then essentially what this equation is saying is that there's more than just a wave here, because it's this layer is maybe expressed as particles, this layer is wave, this layer is field, and this layer is a block. So instead of a wave particle duality, what we really have is a particle wave field block quadrality. And essentially, if we think about this equation, which is a unified field, then as both Schrödinger and Einstein have said, that anything that emerges in the field is not separate, it's one with the field. And so there's a unity that exists, and what we're looking at is this quadrality. And yet another way to think about this is that this equation, what we're calling the unified field, which is really a unified particle wave field block, is also representing innately the nature of love. And so there's, you may think of the action of this field or this equation as being bound by love, and love is really this multi-layered, multi-depth reflection of this quadrality, which Schrödinger's equation gives us an insight into as much as a century ago, but I feel is more fully represented by this kind of depiction here. Good morning. I wanted to continue with the exploration of modeling matter. And in the last week I had related the unified field equation that had been derived some time ago to the emergence of matter. And I want to give some concrete examples and show how this complexification of matter takes place. So recalling that this is the unified field equation, and it's actually reflects a quadrality, not just a duality between wave and particle, but there's wave, particle, field, and block, and this represents the block, if you will. And there's four kinds of dimensions to it that emanate from the four qualities inherent or codified in light. So there's a light matrix that sets the deep template of how matter emerges. there is a space matrix that indicates the emergence of matter from the untransformed layer, and there's a time matrix that indicates when each of these aspects of the layers of light are active. But let's look at this more concretely. So I'm going to take a few examples. And first, let me take the example of the electromagnetic field, and I'll depict that by electromagnetic, here EM, and recall that these four independent dimensions are at the more untransformed level are referred to as the physical, vital, mental, and integral, and in their deeper essence they're referred to as presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So when we think about the electromagnetic field, the question is, how does that field take the codification in light and reflect it in its operation? So if we think about the physical or the presence aspect, then this is through the ability of the electromagnetic field to create particles of mass. I'll represent that by mass, by M for mass. The power aspect is reflected through the energy gradient that is implicit in the electromagnetic field, and I'll represent that by frequency, because the energy gradient is a function of the different frequencies that exist in the electromagnetic field or spectrum. And the knowledge aspect is represented by wavelength, because we have different archetypes for spectrums or waves that operate within this field, from the, for example, infrared, X-rays, ultraviolet, and so on. And the harmony aspect, as discussed earlier, is embodied in the speed with which the electromagnetic field or spectrum moves, which is the speed of light at the untransformed layer. So we can see that that codification in light, how it operates or creates the operation for a field such as the electromagnetic field. Now let's look at another level of complexity and think about quantum particles. So we're looking at different orders of magnitude. So electromagnetic field may exist at levels smaller than 10 to the minus 34 meters. But when we think about the quantum particles, they begin to emerge arguably at 10 to the minus 34 meters. And the question is, how does that codification in light, this fourfold codification, show up at the quantum level? And here, if we think about the presence aspect, that is through the Higgs boson that gives mass to any particle that has mass. And when we think about the power aspect, this is reflected by leptons. When we think about the knowledge aspect, it's through quarks. And harmony is through bosons. And so we see that this underlying fourfoldness is, or codification, organizes the play of quantum particles. Similarly, if we go up a few levels to the atomic level, then, or this is the periodic tables of the different elements that exist. And here we have the presence aspect being depicted in elements that have D shell orientation, and the power aspect by the S shell elements, the knowledge aspect by the P shell, and the harmony aspects by the F shell. And we've discussed this earlier, but just in terms of how this fourfoldness plays out. And then when we think about the cellular level, which is 10 to the minus 6 meters, Then we have the presence aspect being reflected in proteins, the power aspect by polysaccharides, the knowledge aspect by nucleic acids, and the harmony aspect by lipids. So we see that from 10 to the minus 34 to 10 to the minus 6, which is 30 orders of magnitude, how this essential scheme plays out in the organization of matter as it arises, and the organization itself is based on certain core principles, these 4 core principles around which the variety of matter emerges. But when we look deeper and then ask how does this, the different aspects of this equation play out, so let's consider the play of the 2 levels that we're referring to as M2 and M1. And as a recollection, so here I'm going to depict complexity along this axis here, starting from say 0 to greater complexity, and here, along this axis I'm going to depict the play of these fundamental sets that emerge from these deep essences of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So the idea is that as different layers of matter emerge, the size of these sets, meaning that the different elements that are associated with the set of presence, set of power, set of knowledge, and set of harmony grow larger and larger. And so we'll depict that action by M2, and if we plot that, then we can say that the size of these sets generally perhaps follows some kind of curve like this. So as we move from the electromagnetic field through quantum particles, through the periodic table, through cells, then the essential qualities that are associated with these 4 deep essences multiply. So for example, as we've seen at the cellular level, knowledge takes on different meanings. So for example, a nucleic acid can function as a repository of knowledge or library. It can pass on knowledge to next generation of cells through DNA and RNA. It kind of creates a laws for how the functioning of the cell takes place. It encodes within itself how all the proteins shall act, and so on. So there's kind of a complexification on the dimension of knowledge, and similarly there are complexifications along each of the different dimensions as we move across this. So we see that the essential size of these 4 sets increases as matter complexifies or evolves and continues its evolution. Now if we think about M1, which is the signature aspect, and recall that the signature aspect is trying to capture the uniqueness of any organization, and the uniqueness itself is a function of the combination of elements in these sets. So if there are say 10 elements in each of these sets, then right away we see that at this level the number of signatures is a function of that 10 by 10 by 10 by 10, so it becomes much larger. So we would expect that this M1, the complexity of M1 is perhaps approaching this limit here, and it's growing much faster as M2 grows, this grows much faster. And so this captures kind of how we would see the emergence of M1 and M2 over time. And what this is essentially telling us in kind of summary is that there may be levels here that we've not captured, and there may be further emergence that takes place that we still haven't experienced. But certainly, however it does occur, it's occurring along these four dimensions, and the complexity that we see at each level may seem random, but actually is not random. It's a function of M2 and M1, and that's why we see so much more diversity at the more and more visible levels in us and around us.